The sun was setting over Los Angeles International Airport, casting a warm golden glow across the terminal windows. It had been a long day of meetings and studio sessions, and Snoop Dogg was ready for his flight to New York. Dressed in his signature laid-back style, a designer tracksuit, and some ice-cold jewelry, he made his way through the premium security line, nodding at fans who did double takes as they recognized him. As he strolled through the terminal, a group of young kids couldn't contain their excitement, nudging their parents and pointing. Snoop, always one to show love to his fans, gave them his famous smile and a peace sign. Their faces lit up like Christmas trees, and their parents mouthed silent thank yous for making their children's day. The boarding process was smooth, as you'd expect for a first-class passenger. The flight attendant at the gate, a friendly woman with warm eyes and a genuine smile, checked his boarding pass and welcomed him aboard Flight 420 to JFK. "Right this way, sir," she said professionally, treating him just like any other passenger, something Snoop always appreciated. Walking down the jet bridge, Snoop felt that familiar pre-flight energy. He'd flown countless times before, but there was always something special about heading to New York. The city's energy, the music scene, the culture, it all called to him like a second home. As he stepped onto the plane, the first-class cabin welcomed him with its familiar luxury. The leather seats were wide and comfortable, promising a peaceful 6-hour journey across the country. A few business travelers looked up from their laptops, some recognizing him instantly, others too absorbed in their work to notice. An elderly couple smiled warmly as he passed by, the woman whispering something to her husband that made them both chuckle. Finding his seat, 3A, window side, Snoop settled in with the ease of someone who'd made air travel an art form. A flight attendant appeared almost instantly, offering him a pre-flight drink. "Gin and juice?" she asked with a knowing smile, showing she was familiar with his music without making a big deal about it. Snoop laughed, appreciating the reference, but opted for water instead. "Gotta stay hydrated at 30,000 feet, he said, making her smile. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages and responding to a few important ones before takeoff. The cabin gradually filled with other passengers, some trying to sneak subtle photos, others pretending not to notice him at all. A young businessman in a crisp suit took the seat next to him, doing his best to act natural while clearly excited about his seating assignment. The atmosphere in first class was calm and sophisticated, just the way Snoop liked it. He'd earned this comfort through decades of hard work, transforming himself from a young artist in Long Beach to a global icon. As he gazed out the window at the bustling tarmac below, he reflected on how far he'd come. From the streets to the stars, from mixtapes to platinum records, from controversy to universal respect, each step of his journey had taught him valuable lessons about handling whatever life threw his way. Little did he know, this flight would test those lessons in ways he couldn't imagine. As the last passengers boarded and the cabin crew prepared for departure, there was no indication that this routine cross-country flight was about to become anything but ordinary. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and promising smooth skies ahead. If only he knew what was about to unfold in the next few hours. The sunset outside had turned deeper now, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. As Snoop adjusted his seat and got comfortable, he had no idea that this flight would soon become a moment that would capture the attention of millions, showing the world how to handle discrimination with grace, style, and an unshakable spirit that had become his trademark over the years. The flight was about 30 minutes into its journey when the first signs of trouble began to surface. The seatbelt signs had just turned off, and passengers were settling into their routines, some pulling out laptops, others adjusting their headphones, all seeking that perfect flight comfort zone. Snoop had just leaned back in his seat, ready to catch up on some music industry emails on his phone. That's when the cockpit door opened with a soft click. The pilot, a man in his 50s with graying temples and pressed uniform, stepped out for what should have been a routine cabin check. He moved with the confident stride of someone who'd spent decades in the air, nodding professionally at passengers as he passed. But something changed when he reached the first few rows of first class. His eyes landed on Snoop, and his whole demeanor shifted. The professional smile disappeared, replaced by a tight-lipped frown. He paused, looking at his clipboard, then back at Snoop, as if something didn't add up in his mind. The next few moments would leave everyone in the cabin stunned. Interesting choice of seating arrangements today, the pilot muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. His voice carried that particular tone, the kind that makes everyone's skin crawl. I remember when first class had certain standards. He emphasized the last word while looking directly at Snoop's casual designer clothes. A businessman across the aisle looked up from his laptop, mouth slightly open in disbelief. Two flight attendants exchanged worried glances. Their training hadn't prepared them for this situation. The young man sitting next to Snoop shifted uncomfortably in his seat, torn between speaking up and staying quiet. The pilot wasn't done. He continued his inspection, making pointed comments about maintaining the quality of the flying experience and how some people might feel more comfortable in other sections of the plane. Each word was carefully chosen, a masterclass in saying something offensive while maintaining plausible deniability. A woman in row 2 couldn't hide her disgust, setting down her magazine to stare openly at the pilot. Her husband touched her arm gently, silently urging her to stay calm. The tension in the cabin was building like a thunderstorm, heavy and electric. The flight attendants tried their best to diffuse the situation, one of them stepping forward with drink offers, attempting to create a distraction. But the pilot seemed determined to make his point. He stood there, clipboard in hand, making a show of checking seat numbers and passenger manifests, all while dropping subtle yet unmistakable racist comments. "You know," he said, flipping through his papers with exaggerated care, "I've been flying this route for 20 years. Things sure have changed." His emphasis on changed left no doubt about his meaning. The whole first-class cabin had gone quiet now, conversations suspended, movies paused, all eyes focused on the unfolding scene. Some passengers had already pulled out their phones, recording discreetly. Others were typing furiously, no doubt sharing the incident on social media in real time. In row 4, an older gentleman in a business suit was already asking to speak with the lead flight attendant, his face red with second-hand embarrassment and anger. Through it all, Snoop remained still, his face a mask of calm. He'd seen this before, the surprised looks when he walked into high-end restaurants, the security guards who followed him in luxury stores, the valet parkers who hesitated to take his keys. But this was different. This was happening at 30,000 feet, in front of a captive audience, from someone whose job was to ensure everyone's safety. The pilot's behavior was more than just unprofessional. It was a perfect example of the everyday discrimination that still existed, even in supposedly premium spaces. Every passenger in first class was witnessing a moment that would make them question their own experiences and assumptions. A young flight attendant, her hands shaking slightly as she arranged drinks on her cart, caught Snoop's eye. Her apologetic look spoke volumes about how helpless she felt. The other crew members were also visibly uncomfortable, torn between their duty to support their captain and their moral obligation to stand against discrimination. The air in the cabin felt thick, heavy with unspoken words and rising tension. Everyone was waiting to see how this would play out. Would there be a confrontation? Would someone intervene? Would this become another viral video of discrimination in America? Little did they know, Snoop was about to handle this situation in a way that would not only diffuse the tension but turn this ugly moment into something powerful and educational. The next few minutes would prove why he wasn't just a music legend, but a master of turning negative situations into positive opportunities. The tension in the first-class cabin had reached a breaking point. You could hear a pin drop as passengers held their breath, watching the scene unfold between Snoop and the pilot. The usual sounds of a flight, the gentle hum of the engines, the clinking of ice and drinks, the quiet conversations, all seemed muted now, as if the plane itself was waiting to see what would happen next. A young tech executive in the window seat was pretending to work on his laptop, but his fingers hadn't moved on the keyboard for minutes. 2 rows back, a couple in matching business attire whispered to each other, their faces showing a mix of concern and anger. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with forced smiles, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy that had long since vanished. Some passengers had pulled out their phones, holding them at chest level, trying to be discreet while documenting what was happening. The soft blue glow of their screens created an eerie atmosphere in the dimly lit cabin. One passenger's phone showed a social media app open, thumb hovering over the post button, ready to share this moment with the world. The man sitting next to Snoop had given up all pretense of reading his magazine, which lay forgotten in his lap. His eyes darted between Snoop and the pilot, his body language showing he was ready to speak up if needed. The businessman's expensive watch caught the cabin light as his hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white with tension. A flight attendant approached with a fresh round of drinks, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged them on her cart. The ice cubes clanked against the glass a bit too loudly in the tense silence. She looked at Snoop apologetically, her eyes conveying what she couldn't say out loud. "I'm so sorry this is happening." The older couple in the front row had stopped their crossword puzzle, the half-filled squares forgotten as they watched the situation develop. The woman clutched her husband's arm while he sat straight-backed, jaw clenched, clearly wrestling with whether to intervene. Their reactions reflected what many were feeling, the desire to help mixed with uncertainty about how to do so. Through it all, Snoop remained still, his face a study in self-control. His years in the spotlight had taught him how to handle pressure, but this was different. This wasn't about music or fame, this was about something much deeper, much more personal. His hands rested calmly on the armrests, his breathing steady, but his eyes told a different story. They held decades of similar experiences, of having to prove himself worthy of spaces others took for granted. The pilot had returned to the cockpit, but his presence lingered like a dark cloud over the cabin. His words hung in the air, making everyone uncomfortable in their $1,000 seats. A group of passengers near the front began talking in hushed tones, discussing whether they should file formal complaints. One woman was already typing an email to the airline's customer service. The lead flight attendant, a professional with decades of experience, stood at her station, speaking quietly into the plane's phone. Her face showed the conflict of someone trying to handle a situation they never expected to face. Should she radio for support? Should she file an immediate report? Should she try to smooth things over? Outside the windows, the world continued as normal. Clouds drifted by. The sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, and the plane steadily made its way across the country. But inside, in this pressurized tube flying at 30,000 feet, something was about to change. The atmosphere was charged with potential energy, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Passengers kept stealing glances at Snoop, wondering what he would do next. Would he demand action? Would he call his lawyers? Would he post about it on social media? Nobody would blame him if he did any of those things. The pilot's behavior had crossed so many lines, broken so many rules, both written and unwritten. But Snoop had something else in mind. As he slowly reached for his seatbelt buckle, his movement deliberate and calm, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The soft click of the belt releasing sounded unusually loud in the quiet cabin. What happened next would transform this moment of ugliness into something nobody on that flight would ever forget. The air felt electric with anticipation. Even the most jaded travelers, the ones who usually slept through entire flights, were wide awake now, knowing they were about to witness something significant. This wasn't just about one celebrity's response to discrimination, it was about how we all handle moments that test our character, our dignity, and our humanity. What happened next left everyone in the first-class cabin speechless. As Snoop rose from his seat, the tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. But instead of showing anger or frustration, a supple smile played across his face. He straightened his designer jacket and did something completely unexpected. He pressed the call button. When the flight attendant arrived, her face showed a mix of concern and curiosity. Snoop spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, but calm enough to put people at ease. "Could you please let the captain know I'd like to have a word with him? Tell him it's not about what just happened, it's about what's going to happen next." The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, then nodded and disappeared toward the cockpit. The other passengers watched in fascination. A few had their phones ready, expecting drama, but what they were about to witness would be something entirely different. Minutes later, the cockpit door opened. The pilot emerged, his face a mask of professional detachment, though his slightly stiff walk betrayed his tension. He probably expected a confrontation, maybe even a viral moment that would end his career. Instead, he found Snoop standing in the aisle with his hand extended. "Let's talk man to man," Snoop said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had faced these situations many times before. not as a pilot and passenger, not as two people from different backgrounds, but as two human beings who both got up this morning wanting to have a good day. The pilot's expression flickered with surprise. He'd clearly been preparing for a different kind of encounter. Several passengers had their mouths open in astonishment. A businessman in the second row actually put down his phone, realizing this moment deserved his full attention rather than social media documentation. Snoop continued, his words measured and thoughtful. You know, I've been flying first class for over 20 years now. But I remember my first time like it was yesterday. I was nervous, wondering if I belonged. Then a flight attendant smiled at me, treated me like I belonged, and suddenly I did belong. The pilot's rigid posture began to soften slightly. Around them, the cabin was completely silent, every passenger hanging on each word. Even the usual airplane background noise seemed to have quieted down. See, that's the thing about belonging, Snoop went on, gesturing to the first-class cabin around them. It's not about where you sit on the plane. It's about how we treat each other when we're all sharing the same sky. A few passengers nodded in agreement. An elderly woman in the front row wiped a tear from her eye. The flight attendants stood watching, their service duties momentarily forgotten as they witnessed this masterclass in handling discrimination with dignity. I've seen a lot of changes in my lifetime, Snoop said, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone. Some good, some not so good. But the best changes, they always start with two people willing to look past their first impressions and really see each other. The pilot's face had transformed. The defensive mask was gone, replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. He looked around the cabin, seeing not just passengers now, but witnesses to a moment of potential transformation. I could be angry right now, Snoop continued, his voice still calm and measured. I could make some calls, post some videos, make this moment go viral for all the wrong reasons. But what would that change? Instead, I'm offering you something different, a chance to have a real conversation. The businessman who had been about to post on social media slowly put his phone away, realizing he was witnessing something more valuable than viral content. A young professional woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, trying to be discreet about her emotional response to the scene. Because here's the thing, Snoop said, looking not just at the pilot now, but addressing the entire cabin. We're all stuck on this flight together for the next few hours, just like we're all stuck on this planet together for our lives. We can either make it harder for each other, or we can lift each other up. The pilot swallowed hard, his professional demeanor cracking further as the weight of Snoop's words sank in. What had started as a potential disaster was transforming into something entirely different, a moment of genuine human connection at 30,000 feet. The transformation in the first-class cabin was remarkable to witness. The pilot, who just minutes ago had radiated judgment and superiority, now stood with his shoulders slightly slumped, the weight of his earlier behavior visible in his posture. His face showed the internal struggle of someone confronting their own prejudices in real time. I've been flying planes for over 20 years, the pilot finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. And I thought I knew everything there was to know about this job. He paused, looking around the cabin at the faces watching this exchange. But I guess there's always more to learn. Snoop nodded encouragingly, and something beautiful started happening in that pressurized cabin at 30,000 feet. The air that had been thick with tension began to clear, like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. A few passengers who had been holding their breath finally exhaled. An older businessman in the third row removed his reading glasses, wiping them thoughtfully with his handkerchief. You know, he spoke up, his voice carrying years of experience. I've been in business for 4 decades, and the hardest thing to do is admit when you're wrong. But it's also the most important. The pilot turned toward the voice, then back to Snoop. I made assumptions, he admitted, his professional mask cracking further to reveal genuine remorse. I saw what I expected to see, not who was actually sitting in front of me. A flight attendant quietly approached with 2 bottles of water, sensing the moment called for some gesture of support. As she handed them to Snoop and the pilot, her small smile spoke volumes about her relief at how the situation was evolving. Let me tell you something about assumptions, Snoop said, accepting the water with a nod of thanks. I've had people make them about me my whole life. But every time someone took a moment to look past those assumptions, to actually see me as a person, that's when real connections happened. The young tech executive who had been pretending to work on his laptop finally closed it, fully engaged in the scene unfolding before him. His fingers, which had been hovering over his keyboard, now drummed thoughtfully on the closed device. "It's interesting," Snoop continued, taking a sip of water, "how we all have these moments in life where we can choose to stay in our comfort zone or step out and grow. Right now, that's the choice in front of us." The pilot's face showed he was processing these words deeply. A couple in the front row exchanged meaningful glances, probably thinking about their own moments of choice in life. The woman reached over and squeezed her husband's hand. "You know what the hardest part of my job is?" the pilot asked, his voice carrying a new note of honesty. "It's not the flying. It's not the weather. It's the responsibility of carrying hundreds of lives in my hands. And today, I forgot that those lives belong to real people, each with their own story." A flight attendant at the back of the cabin wiped a tear from her eye, trying to maintain her professional composure while witnessing this powerful moment of human connection. Other crew members had gathered nearby, drawn to the unfolding scene. "That responsibility you're talking about," Snoop responded, "it's not just about getting people safely from point A to point B, it's about how we treat each other along the way. Because sometimes the journey is more than just miles in the air." The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to brighten, as if nature itself was acknowledging this moment of understanding. A baby in the main cabin chose this moment to laugh, the sound carrying forward and making several people smile. "I'd like to apologize," the pilot said, standing straighter now, but with humility rather than superiority. "Not just for what I said, but for what I thought, for the assumptions I made, for forgetting that my job is about bringing people together, not creating divisions." The energy in the cabin had completely shifted. Where there had been tension, there was now a sense of witnessing something special. Phones that had been ready to record conflict were now capturing a moment of genuine human connection. Through the windows, the landscape below continued to pass by, cities, farms, and forests all blending together into one continuous tapestry of American life. It seemed fitting that this transformation was happening high above it all, where the artificial boundaries we create below become meaningless. The resolution that unfolded in the first-class cabin felt like watching a masterpiece being painted in real time. The pilot, who had started this flight as an antagonist, was now sitting in an empty seat across from Snoop, engaged in genuine conversation. Their discussion had moved beyond the initial conflict to something deeper, more meaningful. "You know what's crazy?" the pilot said, shaking his head slightly. "I've got 2 kids at home who listen to your music. They're always telling me about how you've changed over the years, how you've grown. And here I am, learning that same lesson about growth from you at 30,000 feet. Snoop smiled, that signature warm grin that had made him beloved by fans worldwide. "Life's funny like that. Sometimes the best lessons come when you least expect them, and from people you least expect to learn from." Around them, the cabin had settled into a different kind of atmosphere. The tension from earlier had completely dissolved, replaced by something that felt almost like a family gathering. A flight attendant passed by, offering fresh drinks to everyone, her movements more relaxed now that the crisis had passed. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," the pilot continued, his uniform somehow looking less rigid than before. "About how we're all sharing the same sky. It's true in more ways than one. Up here, all those boundaries we create down there, they don't really matter, do they?" An older woman who had been listening intently spoke up from her seat. "I've been flying for business for 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. Usually when there's conflict, people just retreat into their phones or pretend it's not happening." The businessman who had been ready to file a complaint earlier was now typing something different on his phone. "I'm writing to the airline," he announced, "but not to complain. They need to know about this moment, about how conflict can turn into connection when people choose to be better." A young couple who had been quietly watching everything unfold finally joined the conversation. "We're actually on our honeymoon," the woman shared, "and I think we've just learned one of the most important lessons about marriage, how to turn confrontation into conversation." The pilot reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. "I keep a logbook of every flight I've ever flown," he explained, his voice carrying a note of emotion. "The weather conditions, flight times, any unusual events. But today's going to be about something much more important. Snoop leaned forward, genuinely interested. "What are you going to write?" "That on this day, at this altitude, I learned that the real measure of a person isn't where they sit on the plane, but how they treat others when faced with disrespect. That sometimes the biggest course corrections happen not in the air, but in the heart." Several passengers nodded in agreement. A flight attendant who had been standing nearby wiped a quick tear from her eye, trying to maintain her professional composure, but clearly moved by the scene. The pilot stood up, straightening his uniform. "I need to get back to the cockpit soon, but before I do," he turned to address not just Snoop, but the entire cabin. "I want to apologize again, not just privately but publicly. What I did was wrong, and how you handled it." He looked at Snoop. That was a lesson in true class that had nothing to do with which cabin you're sitting in. The spontaneous applause that broke out startled a baby in the main cabin, whose surprised cry turned into a giggle that made everyone smile. It was as if even the smallest passenger knew this was a moment worth celebrating. "You know what the best part about being up here is?" Snoop asked, gesturing to the window where the sun was painting the clouds in brilliant colors. "It's the perspective. From up here, you can see how small our differences really are, and how big our connections could be if we just give them a chance to grow." The pilot extended his hand again, but this time it wasn't a formal gesture, it was genuine. "Thank you," he said simply, "for showing me what real first-class behavior looks like." As the pilot walked back to the cockpit, his steps were different, lighter somehow, as if he'd left behind a weight he didn't even know he'd been carrying. The passengers watched him go, many of them knowing they had just witnessed something rare and precious. The moment when prejudice gave way to understanding, when conflict transformed into connection. By the time Flight 420 touched down at JFK, the story was already spreading faster than a California wildfire. Passengers had been discreetly sharing videos and posts throughout the flight, but they weren't the kind of posts anyone had expected to make when the incident began. Instead of angry hashtags and calls for boycotts, social media was lighting up with messages of hope and transformation. One passenger's tweet summed it up perfectly. "Just witnessed Snoop Dogg turn what could have been an ugly viral moment into a masterclass on handling discrimination with grace. No drama, just dialogue. Real change happening at 30,000 feet." As people began gathering their belongings to deplane, the atmosphere in first class was unlike anything the flight crew had ever seen. Passengers who would normally be rushing to be first off were lingering, exchanging contact information, sharing their perspectives on what they'd witnessed. The young tech executive who'd been next to Snoop finally spoke up. "You know, I almost recorded everything when it started going down," he admitted, packing away his laptop. "I thought I was about to capture the next big social media moment. Instead, I got to be part of something way more important." The elderly couple from the front row stopped by Snoop's seat. "We've been married for 45 years, the woman shared, her eyes twinkling. "And we've learned that the hardest conversations are usually the most important ones. What you did today, that's how real change happens." As if to put a final touch on the day's events, the pilot's voice came over the intercom one last time. But this wasn't the standard landing announcement. His voice carried a new kind of warmth and humility. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude our flight to New York, I want to take a moment to share something personal. Today, I learned an important lesson about prejudice, perspective, and the power of choosing conversation over confrontation. To those who witnessed what happened, thank you for being part of a moment I'll never forget. And to the passenger who taught me this lesson, you showed me what true first class really means." The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. A few people wiped away tears, not from sadness, but from being part of something genuinely moving. The flight attendants, who had watched the whole situation unfold, were beaming with pride at how their flight had transformed from a potential disaster into a moment of real human connection. As passengers began to deplane, phones started buzzing with notifications. The story was picking up traction online, but not in the way these stories usually do. Instead of angry comments and divided opinions, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People were sharing their own stories of times when choosing understanding over anger had changed everything. One viral tweet came from the businessman who had been ready to file a complaint. "Watching at Snoop Dogg handle discrimination today was like seeing a masterclass in emotional intelligence. No victims, no villains, just humans learning to be better." This is the viral content we need. The story caught fire in unexpected ways. Airlines started using it in their training programs. Schools asked to use the incident as a case study in conflict resolution. Motivational speakers referenced it in their talks about turning negative situations into opportunities for growth. A week later, Snoop posted a thoughtful message on his social media. Life ain't about where you sit on the plane, it's about how you treat the people you're flying with. Big ups to everyone who chooses conversation over confrontation. We're all just trying to reach our destination together. The pilot, who had feared this incident would end his career, found himself being praised for having the courage to admit his mistakes and learn from them publicly. He started speaking at aviation industry events about the importance of confronting unconscious bias and the power of genuine apology. But perhaps the most powerful aftermath came in the form of countless quiet conversations happening in homes, offices, and yes, airplanes across the country. People began sharing their own stories of times they judged too quickly, assumed too much, or learned too late that their prejudices had blinded them to the humanity of others. The flight attendant who had witnessed everything wrote in her crew report, "In all my years of flying, I've seen countless incidents of discrimination. Usually they end in anger or awkward silence. But today, I saw something different. I saw how one person's choice to respond to hate with understanding can change not just a moment, but everyone who witnesses it." As Snoop made his way through JFK that evening, several people who had heard about what happened stopped to shake his hand. Not because he was a famous rapper, but because he had shown them something rare and precious: how to turn a moment of division into an opportunity for connection.